Ever feel like you're just drowning in information sometimes? You read things, listen to people, but it doesn't quite click.
Yeah, like you're missing the core message through all the noise.
Exactly. What if you could just get straight to the heart of it? Well, that's what we're aiming for here on the deep dive.
Think of us as your conceptual filter today. We got this really thoughtful piece from a listener called This Too Will Pass, a phenomenological reflection on philosophy, pain, and purpose.
Mm.
It's a deep dive in itself, and we're going to unpack the key insights for you.
And this isn't dry theory, believe me. This listener tackles huge questions: cosmology, reality, knowledge, consciousness, ethics, but all through their own really powerful personal experiences.
Right. It's philosophy made very real.
So our mission is pretty simple. Take these complex ideas, make them understandable, maybe even engaging, and show you why they might matter. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So the listener starts by looking at, well, the biggest question maybe. Where did everything come from? Specifically, the cosmological argument.
The idea that there must have been a first cause, like Aquinas's unmoved mover, or the Kalam version.
Those are the ones. But the listener mentions them only to say, look, the basic assumptions here don't really work for me.
Why not? What's their take?
Well, they're not convinced the universe actually had a beginning in time, in the way those arguments often assume. And they also question the idea that every single thing needs some external cause to exist.
Okay, so if they're rejecting that traditional framework, what do they offer instead?
They propose something they've developed called Embodied Informational Process Monism, EIPM for short.
EIPM. Okay, that sounds substantial. Let's break it down.
Right. The core idea is, what if the most fundamental layer of reality isn't physical stuff like atoms, but something more like information? But not static information like in a book. Think active, dynamic, proto-experiential information.
Proto-experiential, meaning it has a kind of built-in potential for experience, like even before consciousness as we know it.
Exactly. That's the really radical part. In this view, matter, the physical world, is just how this information patterns itself, how it looks from the outside, you could say.
And mind, our thoughts, feelings.
That's the inside view, the intrinsic experience of those informational patterns unfolding. So mind and matter aren't separate things.
They're two sides of the same informational coin.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The listener sees the universe less like a line of dominoes needing a first push, and more like this self-organizing, recursive web of informational processes constantly happening.
A bit like a river flowing, always changing, but always the same river.
Kind of, yeah. And they mentioned some big influences here, like Spinoza's idea of one underlying substance, Whitehead's focus on processes and change.
Okay.
And even modern theories, like Tononi's integrated information theory of consciousness and Carl Friston's free energy principle about how systems maintain themselves.
Wow, quite a synthesis. And they developed this
Right.
through AI conversations.
That's another fascinating part. They mentioned using AI systems, ChatGPT, Gemini, NotebookLM, not just for information, but as iterative conversation partners to refine these ideas.
Okay, so this EIPM, it's a pretty different way of looking at the universe. How does it change how the listener sees themselves, their own purpose?
Well, if reality is this flow of information, then you're not some separate self dropped into the world. You are an expression of that flow, an informational pattern experiencing itself.
So purpose isn't a sign from outside.
No, it emerges from within, generated through the process of living, experiencing, making sense of the information you are and interact with.
And they see this as more than just a personal philosophy, right? There's a bigger picture.
Definitely. They frame EIPM as part of a larger necessary project, trying to bridge our first-person subjective experience with the third-person objective view of science.
Which feels really relevant now, with AI becoming so prominent and advances in neuroscience.
Exactly. And things like climate change, huge complex systems. The listener suggests that frameworks like EIPM might offer a way to understand how meaning, value, even consciousness fit into a scientifically understood universe, especially one we're realizing is deeply informational.
It raises that question, doesn't it? How do we build a worldview that holds both our inner life and what science tells us?
That's the challenge, which leads nicely into the next area they explore: metaphysics, and specifically dual-aspect monism.
Okay, we touched on this with the two sides of a coin idea for EIPM. Can you elaborate on dual-aspect monism itself?
Sure. The basic idea, separate from EIPM even, is that mind and matter aren't two different kinds of stuff. They're two perspectives, two ways of accessing the same underlying reality, whatever that reality is.
So under EIPM, that underlying reality is the informational process.
Precisely. Mind is the inner feel of the information processing, the subjective experience.
Wow.
Matter is the outer behavior, how those processes look objectively, scientifically. They're intrinsically linked.
The listener uses a personal example here, right, about
Yeah.
using AI.
Yes, a really telling one. They talk about using AI tools for learning. From the outside, someone might see that behavior and label it cheating.
Okay.
But from the listener's internal perspective, their intention, their struggle, may be dealing with learning disabilities. It's an act of adaptation. Same action, two different aspects, revealing different truths.
That really highlights how easy it is to misjudge based only on outward appearances. We don't see the internal aspect, the why.
Absolutely. And think about the implications, say, in education. Are we just looking at test scores, the matter aspect, or are we trying to understand the student's internal process, their effort, their mind aspect?
It's a call to look deeper, to consider both the subjective and objective views to get a fuller picture of a person or situation.
Exactly. It's about shifting perspective, which is kind of what epistemology is about too, right? The next section, how we know things.
Right, epistemology. The listener focuses on justified belief. Traditionally, knowledge is like justified true belief. So justification is key.
Right.
What's their angle on it?
They accept the standard idea that you need good reasons, evidence, coherence. But they add a crucial layer. Justification isn't just an individual thing. For a belief to be fully justified, it needs, well, a kind of shared understanding.
Shared understanding, meaning it has to make sense to other people too.
Yes, or at least resonate with others' experiences. It's like the social dimension provides external validity. It bridges your inner world with the world outside.
They give an example from their recovery journey about breath awareness.
Learning about it conceptually was one thing, but it only became a justified belief for them when they actually experienced its effects, and crucially, when that experience connected with what others reported.
So the personal experience plus the social resonance provides stronger justification.
That's the idea. And then they bring in AI again, in a really interesting way, as another source of justification.
How does AI fit into justifying beliefs, especially, they mention, as a neurodivergent learner?
They describe using AI almost like a personalized tutor or thinking partner. It helps them connect abstract concepts to their own life, explore evidence from different angles, articulate their thoughts more clearly.
So the AI isn't telling them what to believe.
No, not at all. It's helping them build the justification, helping them construct understanding that is evidence-based, personally meaningful, and communicable to others. It enhances clarity, which helps with the whole justification process.
It facilitates finding that connection and shared understanding.
In a way, yes. It's a tool for sense-making that helps bridge the internal and external. It raises interesting questions about how technology might be changing how we even think about justifying what we believe.
So epistemology for them isn't just proving truth. It's about understanding in a way that invites connection, empathy, shared perspective.
Oh, well put. Which flows naturally into the next topic.
Yeah.
Philosophy of mind, and specifically, phenomenology.
Phenomenology. That sounds
Yeah.
academic. What's the core idea in simple terms?
It's actually very direct in a way. It's the study of conscious experience from the inside. It asks, what is it fundamentally like to see red or feel sad or think a thought? It prioritizes that first-person perspective.
The what it's like aspect. The listener argues this is the absolute starting point for philosophy, right? You can doubt the external world, but you can't doubt your own awareness of doubting.
Exactly. Consciousness, subjective experience, is the undeniable ground floor, and they argue any science of reality that leaves it out is incomplete.
They share a very intense personal example here, don't they, about their son's sentencing.
Yes, a really powerful illustration. They describe experiencing dissociation, feeling detached, like watching events unfold from a distance, even though they were physically present.
Wow.
And that profound shift in the structure of consciousness itself is exactly what phenomenology aims to describe and understand. Not just pathologize it, but understand the experience itself.
And they contrast that intensity with something more subtle, like the feeling of pausing and reflecting during mindfulness.
Right. Both are ways of observing consciousness, paying attention to its textures and flows, just at different levels of intensity. One sharp and disruptive, the other soft and observational.
How does this connect back to their EIPM framework?
Phenomenology provides the essential inner reading of those informational processes we talked about earlier. If science gives the outer reading brain activity, behavior phenomenology gives the inner feel, the subjective experience of that
The
activity.
other side of the coin again.
Exactly. And they also use it practically to understand their own learning process as someone with neurodivergence, noticing shifts in attention, feelings of frustration, moments of insight. It's self-observation.
So in a world maybe overly focused on objective data, phenomenology is a reminder of the value of lived experience.
Absolutely. The listener argues it's crucial for designing more humane systems, whether in justice, education, or even AI development. We need to remember what it's like for the people involved. It adds a whole layer of understanding.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, shifting gears now to ethics. The listener looks at rule utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. Let's start with rule utilitarianism. What is it, and what are the listener's thoughts?
Rule utilitarianism basically says we should follow the ethical rules that, if generally adopted, would produce the greatest overall good or happiness for the most people. It's about the consequences of the rules.
Sounds practical, in a way, but the listener has reservations.
They do. Coming from their experiences, especially with the justice system, they ask, who gets to make these rules, and whose definition of the greatest good are we using?
The potential for bias or overlooking minorities or specific contexts.
Right. They worry that seemingly beneficial rules could end up causing harm or being unjust in practice, depending on who holds the power to define and enforce them. So while the goal of overall well-being is appealing, the mechanism raises concerns for them.
Okay, so how does that contrast with Kant's approach, which they also discuss?
Kantian ethics is quite different. It's deontological, meaning it focuses on duty and the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions, regardless of the consequences. The intention, the goodwill, is key.
And the big principle for Kant is the categorical imperative.
Yes, particularly the formulation about treating humanity, whether in yourself or others, always as an end, and never merely as a means. Don't just use people.
And this idea really struck the listener.
Profoundly. Especially, again, relating to their son's incarceration and their advocacy work. Seeing people reduced to case numbers or problems to be managed, Kant's principle felt like a powerful counterargument, affirming the intrinsic value of each person.
They used the trolley problem to illustrate the difference, right?
Yeah.
That famous thought experiment.
Pull the lever to divert the trolley, killing one person but saving 5. Or do nothing, letting the 5 die.
How would each ethical view likely approach that?
Well, a rule utilitarian might argue for a rule like minimize loss of life, so they'd likely pull the lever, though even they might debate the rule itself in context.
But Kant.
A Kantian perspective would likely say don't pull the lever, because doing so actively uses the one person on the sidetrack as a means to save the others.
Yeah.
It violates their inherent worth, their status as an end in themselves.
So a clash between maximizing good outcomes and respecting individual rights and dignity.
Exactly. It highlights that fundamental tension in ethics. It really forces you to think about what principles matter most when facing hard choices.
Which brings us to the listener's own ethical compass. How did they navigate this? They call it an anti-suffering ethic.
Yes, or a happiness framework. It's less about adhering strictly to one system and more about a core orientation. Actively working to reduce unnecessary suffering and promote collective well-being.
And this is deeply tied to their personal experiences.
Very much so. Seeing the impact of the justice system, questioning punitive approaches that seem to perpetuate trauma rather than heal it, this shaped their focus on preventing and alleviating suffering.
So less focus on retribution, more on restoration and understanding the roots of harm.
Precisely. Looking at factors like poverty, trauma, mental illness as contributors to harmful behavior, and asking how we can address those things, rather than just punishing the outcome.
What are their sort of practical guidelines then?
They talk about moving towards decisions that increase empathy, connection, and understanding, and resisting choices that lead to more cruelty, isolation, or despair.
It sounds like they're drawing from both traditions we just discussed.
Absolutely. You can hear Kant's influence in the emphasis on treating people with dignity, seeing their inherent worth, and you can hear a utilitarian concern for outcomes, specifically minimizing human pain.
But it's ultimately their own synthesis, driven by experience.
Yes. For them, it seems less like a rule book and more like a calling to ease suffering and increase joy, especially for those who are often forgotten or marginalized.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's been quite a journey.
It really has. We've explored the listener's idea of reality as informational process EIPM, the mind-matter connection through dual-aspect monism, justification needing shared understanding, the crucial role of lived experience in phenomenology.
And finally, an ethics grounded in compassion and reducing suffering, drawing from but also personalizing traditions like Kantianism and utilitarianism.
What stands out is just how powerfully they've woven these philosophical threads together with the fabric of their own life. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise.
Not at all. It was a way of making sense of pain and finding purpose within it.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you listening. How does engaging with these frameworks, thinking about reality as information, or mind and matter as perspectives, or knowledge as shared, or ethics as anti-suffering, how does that shift your view of the world?
And maybe more pointedly, reflecting on the listener's focus. What unnecessary suffering in your own life or in your community might you feel called to pay attention to or even try to address?
Something to reflect on. We really encourage you to sit with these ideas, see how they land for you.
And we have to extend a huge thank you to the listener who shared such personal and insightful work. It provided such a rich foundation for our conversation today.